In this next section, we're going to spend some time talking about basic economic principles. And why is it important that we understand some very basic things about how our economy works? Well, in a nutshell, when the economy is moving in a certain direction, it affects different people. And when the economy is moving in another direction, it affects other people. If unemployment is high, if unemployment is low, all of those things directly impact our ability to manage our own money, right? And right now, during the middle of a pandemic, it actually makes a lot of sense if you think about why the different economic things that are happening right now affect our ability to be able to manage our own personal income. Many people have lost jobs, many people have lost businesses. And so the larger economy absolutely has an impact on how we manage our money. Not only that, the larger economy is going to have a great impact on the people in our profession that we serve. So, homeless populations, people who are struggling with lots of different things. The economy will have an effect on that as well. So I want to start by just giving you two pretty basic definitions. What is the economy and what is economic growth? Well, the economy is just a system of managing the productive and employment resources of a country, state, or community. Usually when we're talking about the economy, we're really talking about the US economy, right? How many things are produced and used within a certain period of time. And that is really our economy. So an economic growth means that we are in a period of increasing production and consumption in the economy. So we are producing more things and using more things. People are spending money, which means more things are being produced, and then those people have more money to spend. And that's what a period of economic growth looks like. Obviously, a period of economic downturn is the opposite, right? When people are not spending money, and then that means fewer people are producing things, which means maybe fewer people have jobs, and so it goes in a downward trajectory. And if you pay too much attention to the news or the media in general, it could sometimes be a little bit scary to listen to some of the commentary or analysts, especially right now with the economy the way it is, with so many people losing jobs and unemployment being high. But what I want you to know is that the economy happens in a cycle, or a business cycle. It grows and it contracts over time. Sometimes we go through periods of expansions, and then we reach a peak, a high point, and then things start to slow down and then really start to make a downturn. And then we'll reach a trough, which is kind of the bottom peak, the lowest point, and then slowly start to make a recovery. And it looks a little like this. So you have a period of, here you have a period of going up, this expansion, it reaches a top point, and then slowly starts to slow down a little bit, and then really makes a downturn, reaches this trough, and then slowly starts to make a recovery. But the other indicator that I want you to look at on this chart is this right here, this trend. If you notice, this line continues to go up. So what that means is, even though there is a peak and a contraction, that this next peak may be here and this next trough may be here. And so the whole trend is still an upward motion. Okay, so that might seem simple enough. There is an economic growth and then economic downturn. Well, how do we know if we are in a period of economic growth or an economic downturn? By looking at economic indicators. And economic indicators are just statistics that tell us about how well the economy is doing, both now and even projections in the future. And we have several different indicators. Now, some of them, like the gross domestic product, which is a sum of all of the things that have been produced within a certain period of time. So you'll talk about the U.S. domestic product over gross domestic product over the last quarter. So how many things were produced over the last 3 months? And that is an example of a pro-cyclical indicator. So a pro-cyclical indicator is something that moves in the same direction as the economy. So basically, if the gross domestic product is growing, if the gross domestic product is higher this quarter than it was last quarter, that means the economy is growing. And so it's going up. If the gross domestic product is lower than it was last quarter, then maybe that means we're maybe in a period of downturn, but the economy is going the same direction. And then we have countercyclical indicators, which means the economy and this indicator are going in opposite directions. For example, the unemployment rate, which is the unemployment rate is defined as the number of people who are unemployed and actively looking for employment, who are voluntarily involuntarily unemployed and looking for employment. So that doesn't count people who are retired. It doesn't count people who have made the choice to step out of the workforce for a while for whatever reason. It's the people who are actively looking for work and do not have employment. So it's countercyclical because if the unemployment rate is going up, that usually means the economy is in a downturn. And then the opposite is true. If the economy is doing well, then is growing, then the unemployment rate would be going down. So they move countercyclical, they move opposite of each other. And often you'll hear talk about the future direction or future projections of the economy. And sometimes that's actually a little more important to understand because we know where we are now. But if we're in a period of downturn, what does that mean for other areas of life, or if we're in a period of growth? So sometimes that future projection is actually a little more important. And none of us know what tomorrow is going to bring. None of us can really predict the future. And of course, there are occasionally huge things that happen, like a COVID-19 pandemic that none of us really saw coming last year at this time, right? But there are some things that economists can do to kind of have a little bit of an idea in general about where the economy is going in future projections. And there are two leading things that they do that they use to do this. So this index of leading economic indicators is a number that they get where they look at all of or a lot of the leading economic indicators like the gross domestic product, unemployment, consumer confidence scales, and those sort of things. And that gives them a projection of where they think the economy is heading. And the consumer confidence index, again, is where consumers actually have input into how they are feeling about the economy. And those things can sometimes be projected to by things like investments and where people are spending money. Good indicators are things like new construction. If new construction is starting to slow down, that usually means consumer confidence is decreasing. But you should be at least somewhat familiar with these indicators. Again, this is not a course in economics, but know what these indicators mean. Because if, for instance, if the unemployment rate is increasing and you're working with a homeless population, that may mean you might be looking at increased numbers for homeless populations. Inflation is another word that you probably hear often, but what exactly is inflation and why do we need to know about it? Why is it important? Well, inflation is just the steady rise in the general level of prices. We know that every year the price of just about everything goes up a little bit, a little bit, a little bit every year. And that's normal. That's okay. We can actually sustain a certain amount of inflation every year. It's really interesting to look at prices of items from 10, 20, or even 30, 50 years ago and see the difference in the things like the price of gas, a gallon of milk. Um, I won't age myself by telling you I actually remember the price of gas being under $1, but I do. So, when inflation really becomes a problem, though, is when it happens in big steps at one time. 2 to 3% is generally considered an average, normal, sustainable level of inflation. But when inflation jumps to 10%, 7%, that really starts to become a problem. And the reason that's a problem is because it reduces our real incomes. So, what I mean by that, an easy example, let's say I go to the grocery store and I spend $100 and I have $100 worth of groceries. Well, now it's a year into the future, and that same buggy of groceries would now cost me $102 at 2% inflation. So my money doesn't go as far, basically. Well, again, at 2, 3%, that might not be as difficult to sustain, but if it would now take me $107 or $110 to buy that same buggy of groceries, you could see compounded by hundreds or thousands of dollars why that would start to be a real issue. And that's when people start to get into they can't afford their groceries or they can't afford housing and those sorts of things. Now, another thing that we will talk about quite a bit in this class is interest. And interest is just the cost of borrowing money. So when you borrow money from a bank or any lending agency, that is a service that they are providing to you. And so interest is the price of that service. So it's the cost incurred to you for being able to borrow money. And how that's determined, ultimately, if we're talking from the economic standpoint, is based off of the federal funds rate. And so the federal funds rate is just the rate that banks charge each other, and that leads to how much consumers are charged for interest rates. So, if you will, it's kind of the wholesale interest rate. So, banks or lending agencies borrow money from the Federal Reserve at this interest rate, and then they take that and charge consumers an upcharge for that. So it's based off of that federal funds rate. So when you hear things like the Fed raised the interest rate today, what that really means is the wholesale price of interest just went up. Now that is set by the Fed, or the Federal Reserve Board, which is a government agency that is, their job is to set and monitor that federal funds rate. And so one of the goals for the course is to start to think a little bit like an economist, because that will be a key to achieving financial success. Doesn't mean you have to be an economist, but I want you to think in terms of opportunity cost and trade-offs. So opportunity costs are just basically the cost of the decision you didn't make. So what did you, if you use $100 to buy a concert ticket, what was the cost? What else could you have done with that $100? Or if you chose to save that $100, your opportunity cost would be missing the experience of the concert. And so that trade-off is how we determine opportunity cost. What are you giving up for something else? And then this concept of marginal and utility cost is just basically how much additional benefit you get from the next increment of something. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in class.